You're all very welcome tonight, Céad Míle Fáilte Rómh go léir. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome Frank O'Donnell once more. And especially because Frank is now our president-elect of the Society and will take up the position on the 12th of March. So as far as the speaker himself is concerned, I'm at a loss to record all his achievements, but suffice it to say that he served with the United Nations for 32 years until his retirement in 2009, and has held many important diplomatic and ambassadorial posts, and has been involved with so many societies. For example, the Military History Society, the Kerry Archaeological and Historical Society, and there's a great list of them. And I hope each one of you has read the Genealogical Gazette, which we publish every month, because it gives a very precise picture of Frank's achievements. So tonight he's going to talk to us about an O'Donnell in Egypt, which sounds very interesting. So without further ado, Frank, you're very welcome to address the Society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, and also Shane. I'm actually coming to this standing in at the very last minute for substituting for somebody else who was unable to make their presentation on a different subject than this. So I thought with Michael Merrigan, our General Secretary, that maybe this is an opportunity to put out into the public space, as it were, a little project that just came to me very recently, literally a couple of weeks ago. I was approached by a lady in Egypt, in Cairo. She is a researcher. She's doing a lot of research on Egyptian history, especially the history of the last royal family. And they fell out of power around 1952, and with King Farouk, and then briefly King Fuad II. They went into exile. But their dynasty was founded by a man called Muhammad Ali, not Cassius Clay, the boxer, but Muhammad Ali from Albania, who was an Ottoman official, and his advent to power in Egypt came about as a result of Napoleon's invasion of Egypt around, I think it was 1798, 99. By 1801, Napoleon had left. One of the interesting things that Napoleon did when he was there was discover, or his people discovered, the traces of some ancient canals that led from the Nile River itself, from the Nile Delta, to the Red Sea, to the Gulf of Suez. And in due course, this would lead to the construction of the Suez Canal in the middle of the 19th century. But in any case, Napoleon had to get out, and he was kicked out by the Ottomans, who were the empire at the time in that part of the world, the Middle East. And the person that the Ottoman Sultan, or the Caliph, put in place in Egypt was this Albanian official, Muhammad Ali. So his family were Albanian Ottomans, who was initially the Pasha, and eventually this became a kingdom in due course. But he was there and in power as a vassal of the Ottoman Empire. And he even started fighting against the empire. And in his struggle against the empire, he was very successful, conquering not just Egypt, which we will see later, a map of what Egypt was at that time, including a lot of Sudan, but also the Hejaz and Saudi Arabia, much of the Middle East as we know it today, Lebanon, Syria, Israel, Palestine. And he became quite a threat to the Ottoman Empire, as a result of which the Russians, the British, and the French were very concerned that he would rein in his power and not actually how would I say, not actually overturn the empire. So the British sent a fleet to the Levant and off the coast of Beirut at a place called Junia. They stood for a while, bombarding a little bit. And eventually, Muhammad Ali pulled his forces back to Egypt. And part of the deal was that he would not just be the Pasha of the day, but that his dynasty, his family, would continue to rule Egypt for a long time to come. So this was the deal. And it was a deal struck by a British admiral who actually did not have the permission of the British government at the time. They were against it. But as the treaty details came to London, etc., finally they agreed. So he was therefore installed in power. Now, one of the things which happened, and this was around the 1840s, and around that time, a man by the name of O'Donnell, with a D at the end, according to the source that I will quote later, this O'Donnell captain returned his commission and decided to stay on in Alexandria, where the fleet of, I think it was Napier, had actually gone. And he settled in there. He eventually worked for the Briggs Company. And what's interesting, I mentioned the Suez Canal earlier, but what's very interesting about this is that there had been several canals built at different times to the Red Sea, and going back 3,000 to 4,000 years, incredibly. But what happened with these canals was eventually got silted up and they became unusable. But also the Gulf of Suez, going back in the past, reached much further north than it does today. And as time went by, the coastline descended southward so that the land that had to be crossed was greater in distance. And as I said, the canals got silted up and lost and forgotten and so on. One of the reasons why some of the pharaohs did not decide to reconstruct the canals was a fear that the salt water from the Red Sea, now get this, the salt water from the Red Sea would contaminate the Nile. Whereas, of course, the Nile flows into the sea in the Mediterranean. They thought the Red Sea was at a higher level than the Nile. And even in the early 19th century, a lot of the people in Napoleon's entourage, and later in the 1820s, 1830s, also believed that the Nile, that the Red Sea was at a higher level than the Mediterranean. And eventually somebody discovered, no, actually they're at the same level. And the construction of the Suez Canal as we know it today became feasible. And I think it eventually opened up around 1869. But before then, we had a lot of things going on in the world, and in Europe and in Britain and in France and in Egypt and in the Ottoman Empire. We had the Industrial Revolution unfolding. And so this gets me to why Egypt became very important. Also, cotton was being grown in Egypt. And the United States was undergoing its civil war. And the civil war in the United States was affecting not just food supplies, but also cotton supplies and things like that. And the Egyptians, Muhammad Ali saw a great opportunity. And so the traders of the day started investing heavily in new machinery. The mechanization of agriculture had started off in Europe itself. And a German engineer by the name of Max Eieth became very involved in 1863 in trying to bring in steam engines for plowing, etc., and digging in the Nile Valley. Now, the Nile, of course, seasonally at that time would rise and then fall a little bit. And as the Nile would fall, the land would be fertile, the mud would be soft, and you could plow relatively easily. But as the season advanced through January, the floodplain of the Nile would become dried out and hardened, and the soil would crack so wide, about as wide as my hand, and as deep as a meter, that it became extremely difficult and laborious for the farmers, the peasants, to actually till the land. And so the idea of bringing in mechanized, heavy steam plowing machines was very, very good. And after many trials and errors, Max Eieth managed to get it right. And his book, which was basically Hinterflug und Schraubstock, which is here, and I'll show it to you later, was the source of the story which we will be talking about. And but the lady who got in touch with me, this researcher, who also happens to be a master's student in Cairo University, she would have joined us this evening, except she has lectures right now in medical anthropology. Now, there's a juxtaposition of ideas. Medical anthropology. Well, what country could make greater use of it than Egypt, with all the mummies and the things that they can investigate and understand? So she got in touch with me, and she had read about this in a book by Walter Tyndale, which is an artist in Egypt. And I got myself a copy of it, and it's in English. And of course, Tyndale, well, this is my mother's maiden name, Tyndall. It was, it has another resonance there. It's full of beautiful illustrations of life in Egypt around the 1860s, 70s, 80s. And he published his book towards the turn of the 19th century. And Max Eighth had started writing his book in 1863. And then he published it around 1898, I think, or thereabouts. And of course, he published it in German. And this is Gothic German, which the script is difficult enough to read if you already know a bit of German and you're not familiar with Gothic. It's even more difficult. And I don't really read German at all, so I'm struggling a little bit with this in various ways. But let's come to the O'Donnell aspect of this. We all know the story of Red Hugh O'Donnell, fought at the Battle of Kinsale, got exiled to Spain, and died. But before he waged the 9 Years' War against Queen Elizabeth I, he was locked up in Dublin Castle. And he managed finally to escape, as we know, and by crossing the Wicklow Mountains in the middle of winter, he got a serious dose of frostbite. And by the time he got to Ballyshannon up in Donegal, his 2 big toes had to be amputated. That might have rendered him unfit to be chief of the clan, but in any case, he became the chief of the clan, the O'Donnells, and the Lord of Tyrconnell, and went on to wage his wars. But he died in Simancas in Spain, and you may all, or some of you may be aware that there's been a great effort in recent years, at the beginning of the pandemic, in fact, to excavate the places where he was thought to have been buried in the old Franciscan convent, which is now, the convent was long ago disused, and the urban land that it had was turned into what is the modern metropolis of Valladolid. So we haven't yet found his remains. And if we do ever find them, we'll be looking for a man who lost 2 big toes. Well, that should be easy enough, shouldn't it? I mean, not everybody loses 2 big toes. But the problem with this O'Donnell man in Egypt is that he lost his 2 feet. And the way he lost them was by falling in love with an Egyptian princess, the very beautiful eldest daughter of Mustafa Ali. And how it happened was that she had already, in her childhood, had a nephew of the same name, the same age as her, rather. The nephew was Abbas. He later became the ruler of Egypt. But Abbas and Zohra, the princess, or also known as Nazli or Khadija, Abbas and Zohra were about the same age, but he was her nephew. Her father had a large family of many wives and many children, by some accounts 98 children. But in any case, Zohra and Abbas did not get along together at all as children. They would tease each other, pull each other's hair, and so on. So their father separated them. Abbas was sent off to a school, and Zohra got a governess. And so he imported, as it were, or immigrated, a lady from Paris called Lucy O'Donnell, not from Britain, not from Ireland, but from Paris. Lucy, who had been brought up in France. Therefore, she was very good in French. And Lucy and Zohra got along extremely well until Zohra was maybe 16 and beyond, in fact. Lucy became not so much her governess as her companion. And one day they were walking through the streets of Cairo, and they came to, on the feast of what was called the Husseinain, or the two Husseins, Sunni and Shia, or some story like that. And they came upon a particular mosque. They didn't go in, but they were outside. And suddenly there was a commotion. And what had happened was that the mosque goers, the Muslims, had found some foreigner dressed up as one of them, but fair-skinned and blonde-haired. And he was trying to get into the mosque, and they wanted to kill the man. And Lucy suddenly recognized her brother. And she said, no, no, that's my brother. That's my brother. Save him. And her companion, the princess, immediately got her entourage of helpers and servants to weigh in on this struggle and save the man. And so she did. They saved him and they brought him home, I guess, or somewhere. And as time went by, this developed into quite a relationship. In fact, they fell in love, Zora and Captain O'Donnell. We don't know his first name, by the way, but we know Lucy O'Donnell's first name. And eventually, it became very difficult for Zora, who may have been a widow already by this time, a young one probably. And Abbas, as time went by, Abbas was an adult. In fact, all of this happened when both Zora and her nephew Abbas were adults, at least young adults. And Abbas was furious at all of this, and he wanted to go after this man and stop this romance, which he thought would bring shame to the royal family. And eventually, Captain O'Donnell was seized, but he escaped again. And Abbas went after him, but he managed to have secret meetings with Zora on boats on the Nile. Yet again, eventually Abbas caught up with him, and this time had some assassins hired to kill O'Donnell. And they managed to shoot him 6 times, but not before he managed to kick Abbas in the shin. And because he had kicked Abbas in the shin, when they had killed the poor man, Abbas wanted him buried upside down, head down and feet sticking up out of the ground, so that the jackals and the dogs would chew off his feet. And this was put into a field, which was, people were barred from going in there. And when Zora heard about this, she went absolutely crazy, absolutely insane. She managed to get in there and to dig in the earth and see if she could find trace of him somewhere, but it wasn't to be done. She was then put back in her house and eventually walled up except for the door. All the windows were walled up. She was prohibited from getting out. Her father, in the meantime, had somehow passed away, and Abbas became the ruler of Egypt. And when he became the ruler of Egypt, Zora, felt very much in danger, so she fled to Constantinople, Istanbul, as we know it today. And in Istanbul, she settled down and lived perhaps much of the rest of her life. And eventually, Abbas tried several plots to kill her there, and even had his son, who was a young fellow, I think it was Hilmi or something like that. But he got into trouble because this Zora actually managed to kill a few people who were trying to get to her. And Abbas also tried to kill a few people who were getting to her as lovers. So to cut a long story short, because it is a very long story and I don't know it as such yet, but to cut short my account, let me just say that Zora had a very, very close other nephew, I think it was, or maybe it was a younger brother, Halim. And he eventually tried to help her. He would sneak into her house, sometimes dressed up as a woman, and then he would get out again. But as the years went by, he had his education in engineering in Egypt. Sorry, he had an education in France. He went to Paris, and in Paris he learned French, of course, also, if he hadn't already got it perfectly. But one day, in the parish of Saint-Sulpice, in the center of Paris, in the left bank, he saw this elderly woman coming out of a church, very tall woman with white hair. And it was Lucy, the governess, who had been with his sister, in fact, and himself in their childhood. And he went up to Lucy and he said, "Can I help you?" And they met and they talked. And Lucy told him, I'm fine. I have been very well provided for by your sister Zohra in Istanbul or Constantinople. And that was the last that we heard of that. So there is a French connection to this, and I am wondering whether there was a connection to the French O'Donnell counts or the families that I've researched in my book. Could also be that they were connected to another O'Donnell family, which had some later French connections. But that would be the family of the O'Donnells of Trua in Limerick and Clare. As you may know, there was a John O'Donnell who was the son of another John O'Donnell in Trua. And in 1779, as far back as that, this John O'Donnell was in Cairo and in Egypt. And he was, in fact, at that time, trying to trade with the Far East. But back in the 1770s, the Sultan in Constantinople, Istanbul, wanted to prohibit Christians from trading in the Ottoman Empire. And so this John O'Donnell got into a lot of difficulty. He was arrested, he escaped, and eventually got away. But in due course, the Ottomans changed their tune on the trade issue, and they would allow the trade. And the important thing about it is that the trade route was overland, from Alexandria overland to the port of Suez. There was a huge amount of trade going on that way. So British and American and other ships would go to Alexandria, offload their cargo, take it overland to Port Suez, and then from Suez, it would go around to India and China and so on. And this John O'Donnell eventually emigrated to the United States. He founded a big family business there. He was one of the first people to trade with China, and the family became very wealthy. And they ended up with things like the Canton Railroad Company, and they helped build the railroads. And one of their descendants, Columbus O'Donnell, was a prominent American general during the middle of the 20th century. So it's possibly that there's a connection there, because in the later 19th century, those O'Donnells of Baltimore in the United States married into 2 or 3 French aristocratic families. And so they had these connections too. So this is where I am in trying to struggle with this. We haven't really got anywhere in trying to find out much, because this Captain O'Donnell, who was killed in Egypt, he was said to have been part of the British Navy, when Admiral Napier was trying to push back the forces of Muhammad Ali. But it is also possible that he had some connection with the French. If his sister was brought up in Paris, then more than likely he was brought up in Paris too. And of course, in those days, the wild geese in France, as we call them, the O'Donnells and many of the others, the more famous ones, the Hennessy's with their cognac, and Lynch with their Lange wine, and Bordeaux and all the rest of that. They were known in France as Irish, but because Ireland at the time was part of the United Kingdom, in many other countries on the continent, they would have been understood as United Kingdom people, sometimes called English because they spoke English, or British, but in fact, Irish, even if they had become French. So this is a long and complicated story, and I will just now see if we can manage to make some of the slides work a bit better here, so that I can bring you forward on this. I don't know whether this is working. It's not really. Yes, maybe this is how we do it. So if you should be seeing a different picture. This is a picture from Walter Tyndale's book, An Artist in Egypt, and the illustrations are absolutely fantastic. They're beautifully done, and this would have been done in a later part of the 19th century. So you see life in Egypt, in Cairo in particular, as it was at the time. And if you were to look very closely at the faces of the people here, you would see how he managed to capture beautifully the expressions of the moment, of the individuals. Now, you all know about the Step Pyramid and Absalom's tomb, right? Well, here's the Step Pyramid in Killiney, just a few kilometers from where I am, and Absalom's tomb, as I call it. But in the real ones are the Step Pyramid of Djoser in Saqqara and Absalom's tomb in the Kidron. That should not be the Kidron Valley. It's the Kidron Valley. My mistake there. But the Step Pyramid of Djoser in Saqqara, myself and my family in the 1960s, when we were kids, and my father was a UN peacekeeper with UNTSO in the Middle East, we went in 1965 on a trip to Cairo, and we went to Saqqara. And we visited one of the very first pyramids, the Step Pyramid of Djoser. And nearby was the tomb of a man called Ptahhotep. And in those days, there wasn't much security. We managed to go in and see the mummy of Ptahhotep right there in the sarcophagus. The lid had been lifted off. And if I'm not wrong, I might have even touched the mummy. But Ptahhotep is an extraordinary person because he wrote the first book ever. It is regarded as the first book 4,500 years ago, before the Torah, the Bible, or the Quran. And these are called his maxims or the teachings. And it is really very interesting to see how much wisdom there is in there, much of which was probably taken up later in the other writings. So that was Ptahhotep. And the other great source on ancient Egypt is, of course, the Book of the Dead, where you can actually, if you want to make the effort, you can learn how to read hieroglyphics. And all of these illustrations that I'm talking of, these are from Walter Tyndale's book, An Artist in Egypt. You can see on the left there the front cover of it, and another one of his illustrations. And as I have been talking about the last Egyptian royal dynasty, you can see here on the left the map of Egypt as it was back then. The boundaries of Egypt extended into Upper Egypt or Nubia, what became known as Sudan, or in Arabic, Bilad Sudan, which means literally the land of the black people. And then on the other side of the Red Sea, the Hijaz and what is now largely Saudi Arabia, as well as all the way up. I mean, his forces penetrated up the Levant towards the south of Anatolia, or Turkey as it was. In the middle, the coat of arms of that Egyptian royal family as it became, and an illustration of Muhammad Ali himself. And the story I've been telling you is about Princess Khadija. These are her other names. We know her from the books I mentioned as Zohra, but she's also known as Khadija or Nazli, and how she fell in love with Captain O'Donnell, who was killed for that, distressing her eventually into exile. And I mentioned there Lucy O'Donnell. Unfortunately, my image is in the way a bit there. So this is one of these illustrations, and if you were to zoom in closely, you would see how beautifully the artist has captured the face of this person. And Tyndale's source was the German engineer Max Eighth, who wrote the story up in his book, Interflug und Schraubstock, Sketches in Egypt of an Engineer. And that's it. So this brings the presentation to an end. I think we can get rid there of the PowerPoint if you want, and go back to the main screen. And excuse me, if there are any questions.